Hey, good morning, guys. It is Monday and it is time for Tech Tip Talk. I'm going to wait for everyone to show up. And hi, it's good to have you guys here. Welcome. I'm so glad you guys could join me today. Hi, Christina. Good morning, everyone. There she
Hi
is.
guys.
Hey, good morning.
Hi.
So here we are again. It's another Tech Tip Talk on Monday. I am Sarah Walworth,
Christina McCrath.
and we are both knitting tech editors. And the goal for these talks is to give you guys information on pattern writing and knitting design from a tech editor's standpoint, and also to talk about resources and to answer your questions. So if while we're talking, you guys have a question, just throw it into the comments. We're really happy you guys are here. Hi, everyone. Hi,
We are.
Ruth.
Hi everybody.
Hi,
We will.
Amy. So today's topic is
Gauge. Everybody's favorite thing to love to hate.
ignore, gauge.
Hi
Oh,
Ruth. Awesome.
we're glad you're here, Ruth. It's exciting to be here
Oh,
with
hi
you all.
Jackie.
Hi, Jackie.
So yeah, that's you know,
So gauge. Um, Gauge is the crucial and most important thing in knitting and in knitting design. It is the thing that gets a lot of bad rap in blog posts and in even among conversations between knitters. But if you don't understand gauge and you don't understand what gauge affects, then you don't have something that works in knitting. Gauge is everything.
well, and that's the bottom line. I think the biggest important takeaway about gauge is that it is the most important thing. If the gauge of your pattern is wrong, the whole thing's going to be wrong for everyone who knits it. It matters. And so not only does the knitter need to know what their gauge is, but the gauge on the pattern has to be correct.
Right. So maybe we need to define gauge because I think people use different terminology. Some people use tension.
Right.
Um, Gauge is the size of your stitch. So if you're looking at your piece of knitting, let's say you knit a sweater and you're designing a sweater, your gauge is how many stitches and how many rows are over a particular dimension, whether it
Right.
be 4 inches or 10 centimeters
Right.
or over the whole thing. So gauge is how big your stitch is. And does that all make sense to you guys? I don't know, Christine, if you can elaborate a little bit more. It's pretty much what gauge means, right?
That's what it means. And the reason it's important is because um, if the size of your stitches is any bigger or smaller than the size of the stitches of the sample of the thing you're knitting, it's going to come out a different size.
So for instance, if I sit down with a size 6 needle right now and some worsted weight yarn and I knit what we might call a tension square or a gauge swatch this big, and I just sit here and knit, I can guarantee you that Christina's gauge and the size of her swatch will be different from mine.
Mm.
So there's some two things that are pretty consistent when you're talking about gauge. That's your needle size, that's one thing, and generally speaking they're standardized. And there's the size of the yarn, like the diameter of the yarn, the weight of the yarn, the thickness of it. But the other things that everybody else is different with is how we hold our yarn, how we execute a stitch, our tension of the yarn off of our fingers to our needle can all be different. So this is why it's super important in your pattern you give exact information to your knitters about what gauge they need to achieve in order to duplicate your design in the size that you say it should be. Because if they don't have that information, then whatever they cast on is going to be whatever size it is. And Anna Lulu says different needles to affect gauge. Absolutely. So like
Right.
the
So if you're knitting on a
composition of your needles.
size 6 bamboo needle, your gauge is not going to be the same as if you're working on a size 6 metal needle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Meaning metal versus wood
Mhm.
or plastic or
Mhm.
acrylic. There's all
Yep.
different types of needles. And that can affect your gauge. It can affect your tension too. So,
Yep.
as a tech editor, the number one thing I put in my spreadsheet when I start checking a pattern, I don't know about you, Christina, gauge. I put in the tension.
Top left corner.
Top left corner. I even name the cell because almost everything that we're checking related to measurements and related to dimensions is going to be affected by that number. So how can you, where do we go from there?
Well, so you have to know what the gauge is. You have to swatch. I think that the two important things to take away is that gauge matters the most and is important. It is worth the time to know what your gauge is. So doing a swatch before you do all the math, before you knit the sample, so you have an idea of where you're going. And when you're done with the sample, I would check the gauge again on a large part of the sample. I think it's important to know what gauge to communicate to the knitter on the pattern, and then how to knit a gauge swatch to get as accurate as you can. And there's a lot of different opinions about how to do that, but I think if you think about it as the gauge swatch is meant to be like a snippet of the fabric of your finished item.
Exactly.
It's not a separate thing by itself. It's meant to be like if you cut a hole out of the back of your sweater, this is what you would have. So
really
anything you add to your swatch, like a border or do something differently, or anything that's not going to be the way you knit in the garment pattern knitting the thing, it's going to affect your stitch and row gauge, and that's going to give you a lying gauge. So I think it's important to know that gauge is important, and because gauge is important, it's important to correctly find out what the gauge is and correctly measure the gauge. So like again, when you're measuring for gauge, I would not use like a fabric tape measure. I would use a ruler, something that is static, something that is correct, right?
Right. And we can break that down a little bit. So hold up that swatch again. That swatch is not small. How big do you think that is? Maybe 4?
I don't know. It's about 5 inches, maybe more, 5.5.
This should be like
also,
the minimum size of the gauge swatch.
Okay, row gauge counts too.
Yes.
I know lots of times, I mean, hey, as a knitter, like I'm way different. Like lots of times you do a little bit and you think, oh, this is good. And that's a lot of the reason why people will put borders on their swatches so they don't have to knit as long. They can make it a smaller piece because the borders will hold the fabric flat, whereas this will not. And this is a stockinette swatch. So if you're doing garter stitch, that doesn't apply. But see what I'm saying? The row gauge matters too. It's not just about stitch gauge, especially if you're working a garment.
Exactly.
And actually, Kate Atherley talks about this in a little video series she did for Knitty that I just saw posted yesterday, directed at knitters for why it matters, your gauge, and why you have to wash, what blocking means, things like that. But she talks about what we always talk about too, is when a pattern tells you to work to a certain length, that's a blocked length. That's a finished measurement length. So if your swatch, which you need to wash the same way you're going to wash your sweater,
Mm-hmm.
and then let it lay flat and dry, if it's a different size than how it was before you washed it, then your knitting is going to be the same when you wash the sweater.
Exactly.
So you
So-
need to know your row gauge also to get those lengths that you need so you can knit to the correct number of rows.
So
And in designing, you need to know that too.
The primary thing is you are all knitters first before you're a designer. So you have to also kind of think as a knitter. Why do gauge swatches lie? And the biggest reason is that we make them this big. We make them tiny, and then we expect to extrapolate a large piece, whether it be a garment or an accessory, off of that tiny little amount of data. So if you are designing and you are going to do a gauge swatch before you start making your sample, you got to do big. You got to get as much data as possible. And the reason why is if you're off by half a stitch over the length of 4 inches, that translates to tens of stitches over the circumference of a garment,
Right.
which can be inches difference.
Right.
So in order to set yourself up for success, you've got to go through the same process that your knitters are going to go through,
Right.
and give yourself some good data to work with, both stitch and row. Don't cheat yourself by going small. As hard as it is, that is mostly the reason why gauge swatches lie, because they're too small. There's not
And the
enough
larger-
information to be accurate.
Right. That's the whole thing, right? You need, the more information you have, the more accurate it's going to be. And that's the same with the gauge swatch. The bigger it is, the more it's going to be correct. You'll have a better idea if you measure over, whatever, 5 inches or 4 inches than if you measure over 1 or 2 inches.
And the other thing I would suggest for gauge swatching before you start designing, working out the math, is to measure using a straight edge again. Don't use a flexible tape measure because you're not going to get accurate measurements. Use a straight ruler or a yardstick and measure both as much as you possibly can, the stitch count and the row count over a number of inches, and translate that to per inch if that's what you're working in, or per centimeter. And then when you're working out the numbers for your design, and you're working maybe also the sample, or you're having a sample knitter do it, come back at the end and double check that your sample matches.
And that happens a lot, I would
It
like
does.
to say. There are a lot of times that I mean, that I don't even know how many, like, oh my God, how many patterns have we edited? Like so many, but
I think, well, didn't we count it? I think between the two of us, it's close to 1,000 patterns.
yeah.
Now.
So this happens a lot, that the gauge will be on the pattern and I'll speak to the designer because something doesn't work, or are you sure, or geez, these measurements aren't what you're
They
getting.
don't match.
So what's not adding up? Is the gauge right? Does the pattern need to be changed? And lots of times they'll go to their sample and measure it and it's not correct. It's not the gauge that I was given that they have on the pattern, because who knows why? I mean, who knows?
There could be any
Something-
number of reasons.
Yeah.
It could just be the way that the sample was worked. Sometimes as you relax when you're knitting,
Mhm.
your gauge changes,
yeah.
it gets looser. Or maybe you didn't treat the swatch in the same way that you treated the garment as far as washing and blocking. The other
So
thing
always,
too,
I would always double check your gauge after you finish the
Always.
sample. Be sure that the sample that you've based all these sizes on, right,
yes,
is the gauge in the pattern. Because all those measurements in the schematic that the knitter's going to try to match up to themselves and what they want is based off this gauge.
right,
So
exactly.
if
And
it's
they
not
have,
right, they're going to knit something that doesn't fit.
and they have to do some work ahead of time. They might have to change if they're doing some yarn substitution. They may have to use a different needle size to get your gauge to come close to it. They may not be able to achieve the row gauge that you do.
Even if they use the same yarn, they might not be able to get the same gauge that you
Exactly,
got.
because we all hold the yarn a little different.
Yeah.
So you got to give
Yeah.
the gauge is the primary thing that everything on the pattern is based on. And Jackie said she's going to go remeasure her sample now.
Oh, Jackie, she and I, yeah, we have some interesting conversations about gauge. That's
Yeah,
why she has
it's
the little face there with the gritted teeth.
the grimace. This is Jackie. So, and I do the same thing with some of my clients. Like they'll say, well, my gauge is 24 stitches over 30 rows over 4 inches. And I'm like, but really, according to your math, it's really this. And then we might need to adjust the gauge to really match the math, or very rarely would they need to reknit a whole sample. Um, so you want to give back to what we were saying is you want to give your knitters the best information to give them success.
Right, and
So
isn't that the main point? Like
that is the main
it's
point.
not like, oh, in order for me to, it's not, you need the gauge to be right for the knitter. So that on the
Yes.
pattern, the gauge that's given and the directions that follow equal these finished measurements.
Hmm.
So it's very important what's on the pattern, what the knitter gets, and that it matches the whole pattern.
Because if that's not correct, if they need to modify for length, or if they don't get row gauge and they need to make some adjustments, then it's going to be like a double whammy.
Okay, well, that's a whole nother thing.
It's a whole
Any
nother thing.
modifications that they have to make, or say they knit to your gauge and they don't like the look of that fabric and they want to do a different gauge,
That always happens to me.
right? Come on. You knit a swatch,
Always.
you go, I don't like it, right? So
Hmm.
if they want to make any kind of modifications to fit, if they want to make any kind of changes at all the changes and modifications they're making are based on the gauge of the pattern.
Right.
So it's like, it's everything. What do we always say? Gauge is everything. Gauge is everything.
Yes. Gauge is the crux of knitting.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. What information do you need to give your knitter? You
Mm.
need to give them not just stitch gauge. You should give them stitch and row around gauge, depending on if it's knit flat or in the round. And you need to give it in the stitch pattern that takes up the main portion of the piece.
That is most prevalent in the
Most
yeah.
prevalent, at least that. So that's like the bare minimum. If you have a stockinette sweater that has maybe some little patterning at the cuff or something like that, you can give the gauge um, in stockinette so that they can do a gauge swatch in that pattern. However, if you've got something wildly different going on, such as color work or cables or lace, you may need to consider giving multiple gauges. So, for instance, I edit a lot of yoked sweater patterns, and a lot of times the stranded gauge will be slightly compressed because it just ends up being almost square in some yarns. So you may give a stranded color work gauge so the knitter can know if they're on target and if they need to go up or down a needle size to maintain that size, especially because the yoke, it's so important for fit that the yoke be the right size. But then when they're done with the yoke, they may be knitting round and round in stockinette. So then you would need to give them a stockinette gauge.
Okay, well then wait, I have a question for you, Sarah.
Oh boy. Shoot.
So I'm not a giant fan of asking the knitters to have to attain two gauges simultaneously.
Right.
Because almost never am I going to get, like you said before,
Yeah.
so if I'm not going to get the same stockinette gauge as you, what is the likelihood that I'm going to get the same stockinette and the same color work together that is the same? So what I think it's important for the knitter to, like this, just when you had multiple gauges, it's confusing. So like I'm going to get back to it, but like you were saying about the cuffs or the collar,
Right.
you can give those gauges, but they're not going to be the gauge you tell the knitter they need to achieve. Right?
You can give it to your editor.
You give it to your editor, but it's not even really need to be on the pattern. But for something
Yes.
like you said, a yoke sweater that's going to have a different gauge than the body is very important because all this business up here is like the important business.
It's an important business to make for fit.
Right. So when you have patterns like that, do you instruct the knitter to swatch for both gauges? And maybe they have to change needle sizes going from the yoke to the body?
I wouldn't I wouldn't instruct it, but I would give it because I myself, my gauge changes from stranded to just
Oh
plain
yeah,
stockinette. So
sure.
I already know I got to go up a needle size. But that just comes from practice and from
Oh yeah.
experience. So it's helpful. I think it's helpful as a knitter to have information. Now, some designers, I don't know how they do it, but they actually are able to get with the gauge being the same with stranded and stockinette. Um,
Well,
and
usually, I mean, sometimes I think that includes instructions to change your needle size.
change the needle size so that you can,
Hmm.
there's a really important point. When you're giving gauge and you have multiple needle sizes in your pattern,
Oh, please say which needle is the
the
gauge needle.
gauge needle.
And in the pattern, when you're giving instructions about needles, be sure to say smaller, larger. Make sure you're labeling which needles need to be used. If in the
In
instructions,
what circumstances?
right, and if, say, for example, your gauge needle is a size 7 and your other needle is a size 5, be sure that you say, or a needle 2 sizes smaller than the main needle, or the gauge
Yes.
needle. Oh, we have comments.
So
Jackie
in
says, I recommend different needle sizes for the same gauge between Colorwork stockinette.
Yeah, that's my
Yeah.
case. That's usually what has to happen, but not always. It depends also on the
So then,
yarn and the patterning.
so then if you do that, you're only giving one gauge and a way to get the same gauge with both things as opposed to giving two gauges that the knitter has to achieve.
Exactly.
Do you know what I'm
So,
saying?
yeah. Creative Media K asks a really good question, Christina. If one knits a fabric that needs to be looser than what is normal for a yarn, do you put loose after the gauge so that people do not think it's an error in the pattern?
Oh, you mean so they're aware that
They're aware.
it's meant to be an airy, loose
Yes.
fabric, and they're not like,
Tell the knitter what the
sure.
fabric is supposed to look like. You may even want to include a detail shot of the fabric so that they can feel almost with their eyes, they can feel what the hand of the
Yeah.
fabric. Um, you may want to include information that this is worked at a looser gauge than normally this yarn would be worked at, especially this happens in shawls.
Yeah. And
Um,
there's places to put that, like in the romance, in the introduction where you're talking about how something is constructed. There's ways to
yes.
talk about what kind of fabric you're wanting and what kind of fabric you're expecting.
And you may want to tell them you may need to go use 2 or 3 needle sizes larger than your usual needle for this particular type of yarn. So be sure to swatch. Um, this is really important because as a designer, you are working with fabric. You're creating fabric in your hands with your knitting. And the knitter is not sitting next to you. They don't know what it looks like. So this is kind of a form of technical writing to describe what is the fabric supposed to feel like. It's supposed to be drapey and loose and airy, and there's supposed to be this many stitches per inch
And
and
sometimes
this
that
many
can be
rows.
tricky. So
Mm-hmm.
Jackie says that's a good question. I have uploaded videos that show the fabric up close. Because
That's
I
really
think
great.
because I think people do, like Sarah said, if there is a gauge that's a little bit unconventional, people will say, geez, is that right? So I think it is important to say, you know, that this and giving the gauge and saying that it's going to be looser than normal or tighter than normal, and this is the
Mm-hmm.
reason why, is helpful because things like you were saying before, drapey, those things don't all mean the same thing to people,
That's
right?
true. That's
So
very true.
it's good to have the gauge and to make a note that makes the knitter reassured that it's correct. And showing the fabric is a great idea, and explaining that it's meant to be a little bit unconventional is a great idea. But I
And
am not a big, oh, go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say if, for instance, this might also happen when you use a particular fiber and you're using it at a gauge that isn't standard for that, like what you would find on the ball band. So what you might also need to indicate is in your introductory information is to tell the knitter this gauge is or this project is best worked with these types of yarns with
Well, that's
this
very
fiber.
important because also
Otherwise
substitutions,
they might not be able to get it. They might not be able to achieve gauge if they
right.
substitute something
So,
different.
but substitutions are like fine. Like that's what knitting is, right? use
Yes.
whatever yarn you like, whatever yarn you have, whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
But it is important to note that different fibers are going to have different knit to different
Right.
gauges to
Yes.
successfully. So if you're trying to make like a mohair sweater, you're not going to get the same effect, not just look wise, but gauge
Mm-hmm.
wise with a wool, a different kind
Superwash
of,
wool.
yeah. And even superwash wool to wool. Your gauge
Yes.
is
They're
going to
not all
change
the
when you
same
wash that.
sometimes. Yep.
Please wash your
Wash your
swatches the
swatch
same way you're going to
you're gonna
wash your
wash the
sweater.
garment.
Just like you're knitting it the same way, you want to wash it the same way.
Yes.
I
Anna
find
Lulu's.
linen really hard to get gauge. I think I do too,
Yes.
and I think it's because it's like not consistent, right?
It's like knitting rope.
It's really
I'll be
hard to get
honest.
even tension. It is.
Yes.
It's tricky. That's why I think like linen blends are sort of so nice, because they give you a little more flexibility in the
So
yarn.
Anya Lulu, I have resorted to pre-washing my linen, and I take it
That's a
in
good
the
idea.
hank. I keep it in the hank, and I untwist it and I lay it in hot water because you're supposed to put linen in the washer and the dryer anyways to soften
Right.
it up, and put it in hot water to give it some more suppleness. Otherwise, it hurts my fingers to knit it. So
Yeah.
yeah. So linen is tricky, but remember that you are the designer, and what gauge you get with your needles is what your whole design is based on. So even if it's hard to get gauge in that particular yarn, it's still okay to base your whole design on that gauge
Right.
according to what you get for your sample or for your swatch.
Right.
And
Jackie says it changes when you wear it too. Yeah.
It does.
And that happens with other yarns too. Like
yeah.
sweaters made out of superwash yarn are going to stretch as you wear them more than other types of yarn
So,
will.
Anya Lulu, with linen in particular, I've learned from my local yarn shop owner, Carla at Quixotic Fibers, who's a linen aficionado, is to knit your swatch and then wash it and dry it multiple times before determining the gauge, because it will change so much as you wear it. It gets drapier the more you wash and the more you dry it. So yeah, that's something it's a flexible fabric. It's always morphing and changing. Goody26 says, good idea to dip it in hot water before knitting with it. Just to get rid of that rope feeling is the only reason why I do that. Jackie says, super wash with brownie face.
Oh, I don't see that comment. I must.
Oh, you don't?
Broken. No, I must be broken. But no, I'm not a big fan of making the knitters get several gauges.
Yes.
So if you're listing several gauges on your pattern because you think it's useful for them to know, which is fine, be sure that you specify which gauge is the pattern gauge, what they need to know, what they need to achieve to knit the thing. You know what I'm saying? I'm not a big fan of putting like every single gauge on the pattern. Give it to your tech editor so we can figure out your measurements correctly.
Please give it to your tech editor.
So can you. And so can you. But asking your knitter to get do 5 gauge swatches or whatever, I'm not a big fan of that.
Yeah. So did we answer all your questions about gauge? If you guys throw some questions down in the comments, we're happy to talk about it anymore.
One more thing I'm not a big fan of about what to put on the pattern for gauge.
Go.
Lots of people think that you should always give a stockinette stitch gauge.
Oh, that's
no
right.
matter
We were going to talk about this.
No matter what the pattern is worked in, you should always give a stockinette stitch gauge for gauge because it's basic and that's what everybody can do for a gauge swatch. But if your pattern includes nary any stockinette stitch, it's useless information for the knitter.
I think it is, yeah.
If we're going to knit color work different than we're going to knit stockinette, then whatever color work, ribbing, lace, whatever main thing your pattern's made up of is also not going to be the same. It doesn't relate. So get better to give and it doesn't, and another thing, it doesn't have to be, just because in the standard, in our industry is to give gauge over 4 inches to 10
4
centimeters.
inches.
It doesn't have to be. If you have a project that's in all lace, You can say, the first repeat of chart A is equals this
Measures
many. Yeah.
3.75 inches by 5 inches.
And is this many. Yeah. And you can
Which is
even give a
great.
little, some people will even, if it's something like that, where it's some sort of pattern or design, and it's not as simple as, this many rows and stitches in 2x2 ribbing. They'll sometimes even make up, and I know it's more work, but they'll sometimes make up like a little gauge sample
Mm-hmm.
that you
Mm-hmm.
work to figure out your gauge. Like
You can give them a little tiny pattern of, hey, use this for
right.
your swatching purposes, and it should measure this.
And I think the only reason to do that is if, say, a repeat of whatever the pattern stitch is, like if it's not just something simple and it's like something that's needs to be like a whole repeat. If it's way big, like
Yes,
crazy
exactly.
big, if it's
Especially
like
with
crazy big.
lace designs, you can
Yeah.
have a
Or say
giant
there is
amount.
no repeat. Say the whole thing is different,
Right.
Then you can make up a little snippet for them. But I don't find it very useful. And I know I'm being super opinionated today.
Hey, it's our show. We can do that if we want.
But I don't find it super useful to give a gauge that is nowhere in the pattern. Who cares?
The other thing that I would highly recommend is to not give the knitters
Hi, guys.
partial gauge. So don't give them fractions of a stitch to measure.
Oh.
So don't say, oh, it's 20.5 stitches over 4 inches and 26.2. Don't do that. When you are measuring your gauge on your sample or on your swatch, and you want to give this information to the knitter, give them whole stitches. So let's say it's not 4 inches. That's all right. 4 inches is not a standard. 4 inches and 10 centimeters, and we talked about this last time. You can go rewatch that video about 4 inches is not equal to 10 centimeters and what to do with that. But give them whole stitches. So say 21 is 4 inches, 4 1/4 inches, or whatever. It's very hard to measure half stitches.
It is.
It's
hard.
Less
accurate.
It's way less accurate.
There's no way that you're going to get that accurately, measuring quarter stitches, parts of stitches. I've had that in a bought pattern. I didn't notice at time of purchase, so I had to fudge it. You mean the gauge given that way?
The gauge was given in a fraction. Yeah, I think that automatically sets up the knitter to be frustrated. So give them whole stitches that they can use to put up against a ruler. And remember that most knitters are smart enough. No, I'd say all knitters are smart enough to measure to the 1/4 of an inch or to the 1/2 of a centimeter. So whatever.
But a fraction of a stitch?
Yeah, a fraction of a stitch is hard.
So I don't know. I feel like it depends on the weight of the yarn. Ursa is 11.5 stitches to 4 inches, which is easier because it's bulky weight. So it's easier to measure because the stitches are larger.
Yeah.
Right.
The stitches are large. If it's a chunky weight or bulky weight, you can measure a 1/2 of a stitch. A little bit easier than definitely if it was lace weight, you couldn't. It would be hard.
I'm curious, and this is what kind of bugs me about how we feel we have to do things the way they've always been done, right?
Yes.
Like, if the gauge to Ursa was 11.5 stitches to 4 inches, why not give gauge over a measurement that makes that a whole number?
So like
why do we feel locked in
over
by these
5 1/4?
Why do we feel locked into these 4 inches when we could make something simpler to measure? Do you know what I'm saying?
And it's an idea.
Like half a stitch takes up much more space. Yeah, because it's bulky weight. It's a larger yarn. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, we had a question back here I think we missed. Let me
When
scroll
giving
back.
a length in a pattern, for example, knit until piece measures 12 inches, the knitter will not likely block their project at that point. Can you give the knitter an unblock? Oh, okay. Giving unblocked measurements is, again, not useful because
I don't think it's useful. Everybody's unblocked is going to be different.
Your unblocked gauge and my blocked gauge, whatever. My unblocked and blocked is not going to match your unblocked and blocked,
not going to match.
even if our blocked matches. right?
Right.
So,
I agree.
and the only guaranteed thing in the pattern is the blocked gauge. Unblocked is a mystery. Who knows what you're going to get? And no, you're not going to block your project in the middle of what you're doing. Sometimes you can, but most of the time people aren't going to do that. And that's
So
why
then,
it's so useful to know your gauge when it's
exactly.
blocked, so that you don't take out your tape measure on your lap while you're sitting on your couch knitting at night, which you're not going to get the right
And
measurement
measure
anyway,
this kind of,
right?
measure a
But
curve.
knit to the, that's why it's so important to know your gauge, because then you can knit to your blocked row gauge instead of to those number of inches.
And you can give the knitter that information. So if they're knitting straight for 10.5 inches, tell them how many rounds that is or how many rows.
Yes, you can tell them how many rows, but then
Why not? And
that's
then
another place that the knitter needs to be wise to know that.
row count instead of going to an inch.
Right. So if they got the gauge on the pattern, they can use the row count. I love patterns that say,
I do too.
as a knitter, I mean, X number of rows. I mean, unless I didn't get their gauge, then you have to.
Then you have to do the math yourself, because as knitters we do that if we might need to adjust and find our own row gauge, and what the length would be in our own blocked gauge. We had another question.
I think knitting to row gauge is a really good idea.
I agree.
And knitting to your blocked row gauge. I don't love giving both of them, again, for the same reason. The knitter's going to then feel pressure that they have to achieve simultaneously this unblocked gauge and this blocked gauge.
Right.
You know
Exactly.
what I mean?
Don't bother with doing any unblocked measurements unless you're putting that into the gauge section of the pattern, if it's required for style or if you find it's important so that people can. Sometimes people find that important. I personally don't think it is, because everybody's unblocked gauge is going to be different.
Well, it makes the knitter feel like they have to achieve both simultaneously, and I don't love that.
Yeah, that's true. What they need to achieve is blocked. That's the important point. So the other question that we missed way back up was, do you have any tips on cotton yarn? And the same principle applies for every type of fiber. When you knit a gauge swatch or you knit your sample, you're going to wash it. So if your cotton yarn on the care instructions can go through the washer and the dryer, then that's what you would do. You would put your gauge swatch through the washer and the dryer, measure it before you wash it, and measure it after you wash it so that you can see what the difference is going to be while you're knitting. But the principle's the same, from wool to silk to mohair to alpaca, always the same. Treat your gauge swatch in the same way that you're going to treat the finished garment.
And really think about that your swatch is like your sweater. It's what it is.
It is. It's a tiny piece of your sweater. It's a little chunk out of your sweater.
And you're going to spend so much time knitting that sweater that if you end up knitting your sweater and it all turns out wrong because you washed your swatch wrong, you're going to be mad.
Yeah, exactly.
So just wash it the same exact way you're going to wash your sweater, because it really is like a snippet of your sweater.
Yeah, we're very happy to answer your questions. We did get 2 questions before we started, and it's related to sizing. Are we ready to go there, Christina? You think we covered gauge?
Just one last thing I wanted to say about putting a half a stitch in your gauge. I have seen that, obviously, and usually it is with big yarn.
Right.
Because what ends up happening is giving gauge over lots of time. Like, it's hard to know what to advise, because sometimes it happened once to me. She thought, well, I'm going to give the gauge over just 2 inches, because if I give it over 4 inches, it's not even. But then you also don't really want to give gauge over 2 inches, because we know that over 4 inches it's tiny. Not going to be the same, right? So, like, it's not really just 2 by 2, 2 times 2.
Right.
So I think it can be tricky when you're working like with Ursa, like big yarn.
Big yarn is tricky.
But that's where
it's hard to design in. It's hard to knit in. That's why there aren't that many.
We need to challenge like this way that we feel stuck. Like I would much rather always measure gauge over even stitch count, and the size of it be whatever it needs
Yeah,
to be.
so that would be 22, 23 over 8 inches. Would you want it like that for her previous gauge for Ursa?
Well,
Hmm.
I just think that it's so difficult to measure these fractions of a stitch. Okay, so as someone who works in a yarn shop, I don't love the advice you give gauge
Gauge
over
over
non.
non-standard, but what's standard
I don't like the
measurement,
advice you
Jackie?
give gauge. Oh, well, standard is like 4 inches, 10 centimeters.
4 inches?
And I think the reason that she's saying that, I mean, she can obviously speak for herself, but because it's what
Oh.
everyone does, right? It's what everyone expects. It's what everyone's going to do. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe if you look at the gauge on a pattern and it does say that it's really 4 1/4 inches, you
Mm-hmm.
might not even pay attention to that or even have noticed that or anything. You're going to
Yeah.
do it the way you know to do it because it's the way it's always been done. So I totally, like, I see I see that. I can glance
Because
at the
when a
pattern.
customer comes in with a pattern I don't know and asks for yarn recommendations. So in other words, they're trying to look for yarn to fit a particular
Right.
gauge and have some understanding of what yarns we have in the shop that will work for it if she can glance at the pattern. And that's really true. That is a situation where that would make sense. So we're looking at it from two perspectives here. From the knitter's perspective, it's going to be tricky for them to get half a stitch and make it match a particular 4-inch length. From the yarn shop, they're looking at, well, it says it's 26 over 5 1/4. So then that may make it trickier for yarn substitution. You would have to do the math to find out exactly
Yeah.
how
No,
much it is
I mean,
per inch.
it definitely makes it trickier. The only thing I worry about when, um, it just makes it, because as you break down that gauge
Mm-hmm.
by inch,
By
like say
inch.
say you want to figure out your row gauge for how long to work,
Mm-hmm.
then you've got even more fractions of a
Mm-hmm.
stitch, right, that you're dealing with. Honestly, if it were over 4 1/2, I would probably not even see the half. That's what I'm saying. I think that because we're so used to, it's like
Mm-hmm.
it's how we size to the bust measurement.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to
Yeah.
take unlearning for people to not like, if a pattern says this is sized a different way, or check your bicep, this is the important measurement, or the neck, or whatever it is, people automatically are looking at the bust measurement to size the pattern to themselves because that's what we've always done. And I think it's the same thing with the 4 inches. It's what we have always done and what we're used to.
So we get kind of into a way of doing things the same way. Maybe we need to think outside the box. The other thing I might
Yeah, Ruth.
suggest,
Well, Ruth says you can write stuff explicitly and people just don't read it. And that, I mean, you can go crazy, right? Like put it in bold and note, and some people
italics,
just aren't
asterisks.
people still aren't gonna see it.
And the other thing too for yarn substitution
But
is
it is a tricky
sometimes
thing. I don't know.
it is tricky. It may help to look at the weight of the yarn that's used in the sample per yardage, not necessarily the stitch gauge over 4 inches. So yarn substitution is tricky. Jackie, I don't envy you. It can be very hard to meet a customer's needs when they come in with a pattern. So kudos to you and all the best for finding what works best for a customer. What if you gave the gauge with half a stitch over 4 inches and then gave a note? Absolutely. Like we said, it's really just giving the knitter the best information in a concise manner that gives them the success they need to set up the project and to make it to match your design. There's no one way to do things. We have our opinions because we're super opinionated tech editors, but you can do things whatever way works best for you and your style and your method of pattern writing.
And your knitters, right?
And your knitters, what do your knitters prefer? What is your favorite fans? Who are they? What do they like to have?
So she's saying you
Um,
could give a note after you give your 11 1/2 stitches to 4 inches. You
mhm.
could give a note that says to check your gauge
Yeah.
accurately, measure for 21 stitches over 8 inches.
So give them the information that they need to help them succeed, but eventually it really is in the knitter's lap And it's their responsibility because it's their project, their yarn, their needles, to make things work according to your
That's a
pattern.
really good idea, because then you're giving them the gauge they expect
Mm-hmm.
to have. But
They expect to
and
have.
not only are you giving them a more accurate way to get the gauge in the pattern, but you're giving
Mm-hmm.
them a little sneaky advice that
Yes.
it's really important to measure
To
over a large area.
knit a large gauge swatch.
Large
Come on,
gauge
it's
swatch.
bulky yarn. You can knit 23 stitches. So
Yeah.
here's, we did have two other questions. We're almost out of time, so I want to make sure we
Mm.
get these covered. And they're about sizing. So Wahoo asked, how do you know when a neck circumference is too big?
For the cast on stitches, I think she asked.
For the cast on
for
stitches.
the cast on in the neck.
So if you already have, I would ask, are you talking about when you're grading out the sizes? You need to look at your sample size. What is the circumference in relation to the neck girth? Like your girth is the circumference. Or what is your circumference in the sample related in proportion to the shoulder width? So you're going to go back, like we've mentioned
You
before,
need to go to the size charts.
size charts. You've got to look at that relationship between the neck opening and the body measurement in that size. And
The
then,
same way you would do for measuring any part.
yes,
right?
exactly. And so then what you do is you apply, this is just basic grading principles, you apply that same principle, the same proportion and the same ease measurement across all the sizes. Then you'll realize when you look at those numbers, if you are knitting for or grading to a size 6 or 7X, you will realize, hey, 32-inch neck circumference is huge. That's not going to work. So it's got to match the body. It's got to fit the body in the same way for each size across sizes. But
And
you
be
got to
sure
use
when
your good size chart.
One thing I think you need to be sure of in casting on at the neck, is there going to then be some kind of border picked up later, or is this your neck beginning? Because it matters, right?
It
You
does
need to
matter.
factor in whatever border is going to be added on, if there is one, and if
Yeah,
there
if
isn't
there's
one,
trim
okay,
or a
but
collar.
yeah, find out
Right.
what that's going to be.
I think we have a comment.
Joan says, I have a client who uses non-standard size swatches, states how many to cast on for the swatch and exactly how to work the swatch.
And then what size it would be. Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot we were saying that about like specific stitches, but you can certainly do it anytime. There are people who give instructions for how to swatch.
Yeah,
and I think
feel free to do that.
The same as giving that note or giving it over whatever. It's like a way that you have control over
yes,
this pattern and what you think needs to be done.
And how to be helpful for your knitter.
And how to be helpful and to get them what they want, right?
Yeah. And it can be in like a little tiny text box. It doesn't have to take up a lot of room.
Yeah. That's usually what I've seen. Somewhere on the front there's like a little section that's like gauge swatch. Yeah. And there'll be a note that says, you know, why it's important to do.
Exactly. So we have one last question, which was about armhole depth. If there is 0.5, so half an inch ease at the armhole depth from the body size, in the sample size, how do you apply it to, should the larger sizes have more armhole depth? My opinion, and a lot of people may disagree with me, is give the same amount of ease across sizes. So if you have half an inch of armhole ease in a size 40, and that's your sample size, and then you need to give that same amount of ease when you are grading in all the sizes. When we add or subtract ease in different ratios, different proportions, it actually changes the fit of the garment. You want the garment to fit the same way no matter how, no matter what size, in relation to the body size chart that you use. Now granted, if your body size chart's off in the armhole depth, then that's going to be an issue too. But generally speaking, the principle is apply the ease in the same way in order to meet your restrictions of stitch gauge or stitch, pattern multiples and all that.
there seems to be some kind of, I mean, I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn, but there seems to be some kind of myth out
Hmm.
there that
Larger sizes need more ease,
the larger sizes need more ease everywhere.
which is
Larger sizes need to have these
it's a
like
joke.
more ease here, bigger than their body. Um,
No.
wouldn't you
Mm-mm.
want the to fit the way it fits in the picture, to fit the way it's supposed to fit?
Yes.
And that's why the schematic is there. Okay, the schematic's
Hmm.
important. You're using a size chart that you have found to be reliable, that you've gotten good feedback on, your whatever. I mean, you want to
Right.
do the best you can to find a most reliable size chart that you can, and we do talk about that in
In another talk.
another
Go.
talk. But
Yeah.
just because you have a bigger body doesn't mean you
Hmm.
want all this extra fabric everywhere.
No.
And I don't know if that misconception is there because it's people just think that, or if it's a misconception about how sizing works. People sometimes think that if there's this much of an increase in your bust, that same
Hmm.
amount of increase from body size to body size happens everywhere on the body.
I think
Right?
it might even be rooted in the designers assuming some intention on what they think it should fit.
Yeah.
That it should fit differently in the larger sizes,
I
and I
think some
honestly
people
think
too,
that's rooted in fat phobia,
and I
that
think
they
some
would have a
people
different
too,
fit.
they want to make sure, right?
Hmm.
So you want to make sure that you have your sweater goes up to large enough sizes and small enough sizes. You want to make sure. So you're
Yeah,
like, well, just to be sure, I want to make sure it'll fit. So just to be sure, we'll
I'll add more ease.
add more ease here. And that's
Yeah,
why the
no, that
schematic
doesn't
matters.
work.
So if you have a schematic on your pattern of what the measurements are, the
Hmm.
bicep measurements will be listed.
Right.
And the yoke depth sometimes is listed, sometimes armhole depth is listed, not
Bust is
all the
always
time.
listed.
But the bust is listed, the bicep is listed. Wrist, like people can look at the schematic and say, okay,
I want
this
more ease. I'm
this
going to
size
choose a knit a different size.
or this
Let
size will
them
fit me.
decide.
But it's almost like lying to the knitter
Yes,
to show a picture of what it looks like and to explain in your
exactly.
introduction how it's going to fit.
Hmm.
And then they go to knit it, and unbeknownst to them, you've made their size completely different
And
than
fit differently.
your introduction and completely different than the picture. It's like lying,
Don't
right?
lie to your knitters.
It's not ever, I mean, like I said, I might be speaking out of turn because this may
100% on board with you, Christina. Yeah,
anybody except the knitter what kind of fit they
exactly.
want or what kind of sweater they want to wear.
Exactly.
So
Let the
you do
knitter
want to apply the
decide the
same ease
ease.
across
Hmm.
sizes on all points of the
Yep.
body. The
Yep.
same ease across sizes on all points of the body. And like I said, sometimes I think people think that because the bicep measurement can be so tricky and can be so, like, it's kind of subjective. Like everybody seems to have
Yeah.
like different arm measurements no matter what your size is. But I don't think,
True.
but that's why you have the schematic. It says there.
Yes. And then let
You
them
don't,
choose. Let the
yeah,
knitter decide if they want more or less ease.
yeah.
I personally am I have a small body. I like more ease. But I'm gonna choose to knit a size that matches my ease.
Or you're going to
But
pick
I'm
a sweater
mhm,
that's just a different design
different design.
or
So
something.
we are out of time for today.
Mm.
We love talking to you guys. We love being helpful. Go to the link in my profile if you're interested in a little thing that we made for you, which is a design checklist before you send your pattern to your editor.
Yeah.
And
It's a
we
good
also have,
checklist just to check off what you want to make sure is all good before you send
we
it off.
think it's cool. And then if we also have some things coming down the pipe that we like to provide for you guys in the next few weeks. So we'll see you next Monday. Send us questions if you have
Any
them.
questions?
And
Swatch
we'll
out.
see
We
you.
might be opinionated about the
Swatch.
answers.
Everybody swatch large and have a good week.
Bye.
See you guys soon.